Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
When we think of chefs, it's the glamour we notice, but there is more than meets the eye. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Gretchen Hansen recalls catching the passion for cooking at an early age. When a new book, When It's Done, Making of a Chef, she writes, that's not something that she had thought of as a profession. Eventually, she opened the restaurant Hobo's in Rehoboth Beach. In her autobiography, she describes not only the craziness of the food industry, but her own journey from concerns about physical appearance to becoming a vegan. And we have her in the studio this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Don.
So, what was this passion with food, and why did it happen at such an early age?
You know, I wonder that myself. I think about that a lot, why my calling began so early in my life. And I feel that it was mostly because food was safe, because I could make food do what I wanted it to do. Like, it behaved in a certain way. It wasn't erratic. It wasn't dramatic. It was comforting. It was love. It was there. It was physically present, and it could become an art form later in my life. But at that time, it really represented love. It represented comfort and nurturing.
Well, you described your early childhood. I think, as a quote says, I was strange and awkward and quixotic. What did you mean by that? And how does that fit into the food passion here?
I don't think I've changed that much, quite honestly. I was a very strange child. I started reading very early. I wasn't surrounded by other children, so I was surrounded by adults. And this was in the late 60s, and it was a strange time to be a child in Southern California in the late 60s. I grew up in a commune part of the time. I was surrounded by university professors and students, and I developed all these bizarre passions. Like, I was madly in love with Walter Cronkite. I mean, just madly in love with him. I thought he was just the most perfect person in the world. But that was when I was 3, and that's a strange passion for a child to have. I was the same way about food. Like, I would go from recipe book to recipe book to recipe book, reading the recipes as if they were literature.
So you describe your mother, and what I could only talk about as being sort of body shaming. That is, that you were supposed to be overweight. Tell me about that experience.
That was later. That was when I became a teenager. And most teenagers, as you know, we know, they sprout hips and breasts and they become curvy, especially, you know, the girls. Boys now do too. But at that time, it was something that I think she didn't expect. And she had been shamed her whole life. So the way she parented me mimicked the way that she had been raised, and that was as a shaming structure. And so what I learned when I was in my early teens was that it was not okay to be feminine or curvy or heavy or in any way different than what the Southern California norm in the 60s was, which was, you know, basically you wore a string bikini and you were a size 00. And I was not that child. I was weird, and I was heavy, and I didn't fit in.
I mean, a lot of women go through this even to this day.
Sure.
I mean, I can remember some television series in which some woman passes herself off as a man in order to get a job, and one of the things she notices the most is that men, they don't really pay much attention to how they look.
Sure. Well, and they don't, I don't think. I mean, it's funny because I was thinking about this the other day about how women are so conscious about the way they dress and the way their hair looks and the way their makeup is. And I watch men get dressed, or men, you know, go out and present themselves in the world, and they don't really care if they wear the same shirt 2 days in a row or the same shirt twice in a week. It's not important to them. Where women, they're consciously looking at, okay, well, I wore this dress or I wore this suit, and I can't wear that again for at least another month because people will see that I wore the same thing twice. And amazingly enough, no one actually notices what you wear. That's the most stunning thing that I've learned from this, is nobody cares if I wear the same jeans 5 days in a row.
So you mentioned, by the way, you grew up in part in a commune. What was that about?
So it was the 60s, and
Great.
That was what was sort of happening back then. And I grew up in a commune it was a couple of years. It was very different. There were geodesic domes. It was on the property that my grandparents had bought for my mother, and it was a farm, a horse farm. And basically, the commune was filled with gay men who just were checking out for a while and expressing themselves sexually and becoming androgynous. And it was a lovely experience. When I look back at my childhood, those are my fondest memories.
Do you cook for them?
No, I don't think so. I don't have any
Was
memories
not
of cooking
at
for
all,
them. The
huh?
only memories I really have are around campfires and exploring the woods and the arroyos and sorrentos around our house. We lived in the middle of nowhere, and we used to go foresting. Basically harvesting from the plants that grew native. So I remember that, but I don't really remember the cooking.
Now, you also talk about what I think is your maternal grandmother.
Yes.
What was that relationship like? How important was she to you?
She was incredibly important to me. She was probably the most important person in my world up until the point that I had my children. She basically raised me. I mean, my mother was there, but she wasn't really checked in all the time. So I would go back and forth and spend time with my grandmother. She taught me more how to cook and more how to basically do the things that I didn't know, like preserving and baking and things that, were harder to learn from a book than not. But she was safe and she was secure, and she was how I found the Delmarva Peninsula. We used to summer with her from the time we were 2 years old. From the time I was 2 years old, I would summer with her. And every summer we would come out from Memorial Day to Labor Day and just spend the summer in Rehoboth Beach. And those are really the happiest memories of my life.
Now, you talk about how you then ultimately moved to or wound up in New York, I guess in the 1980s. And that sounds like it's the moment that you really could have expand your culinary horizons in terms of all kinds of, not just, I guess, American foods, but this whole plethora of international and national foods.
Well, the 80s in New York, everything was exploding. I mean, the food supply was exploding. From one minute you have maybe cremini mushrooms, if you're lucky. The next minute there's chanterelles and shiitakes and portobellos. And all the things we take for granted now were just starting then in a way that was so exciting. You could find strawberries that were the size of your pinky. You could find fiddleheads. There were beautiful foods, Dean and DeLuca, all the places that now we think of as just standard fare. Back then, that's when they were opening, and it was like literally being in Disneyland if you were interested in food. There were so many things to explore and play with, and techniques that were being, learned and passed around. I mean, it was a very exciting time.
And I get the sense that this was really a major introduction to the food industry. What was that like?
It was, yeah. I look back at that time, and I'm still overwhelmed with how much knowledge was passed in that decade. How I grew up basically as a chef during that period of time. I mean, one minute I'm doing pretty traditional Mexican foods and borderland foods. And the next minute, I mean, I'm being introduced to things from all over the world, Far East, sushi, you name it. I mean, it was just exploding. And it was such an exciting time. I used to go to this warehouse down in the meatpacking district, and there was this guy that had these catalogs that were just filled with all these different things that he could order in. And of course, they were so dear, you could hardly afford them. But every penny that I earned went to buying new and different foods for me to play with, different spices, saffrons and zatars and curries. And oh my gosh, so many different things that you just didn't know. You didn't have a chance to explore up until that point.
And it sounds as if that was really sort of a crazy time. But I mean, in terms of the food industry and the characteristic, the atmosphere in which you were working.
Yeah, so the 80s was, I think, marked by massive amounts of drugs. And, I mean, there's no other way to put it, and sexual promiscuity. And I certainly, more so than most, fell into that pit in the 80s. And it was at least 2 years before I escaped. But it was a very learning experience. I mean, it was filled with passions. It was filled with addictions. It was filled with different directions that you race and explore, and then you reach a dead end. You turn around and race the other way, and you explore, and then you reach a dead end. And I think those years in New York shaped me probably more than just about any other time, except being in Rehoboth.
And what is it about drugs and the food industry? I mean, we've described this, I guess, before in an earlier interview, but what is this connection? Why is it that if you're in the food industry, you're doing this thing that's pretty fast turnaround stuff, and then it's like the drugs sort of come with it?
Yeah, so I didn't connect this until later. I didn't really figure this out, but I only did drugs for a very short period of time. So in the process of becoming, drug-free over time, I realized what I was searching for with the drugs was a matching of that intensity that you get with food. And especially on the nightly line, as you're working the nightly line and preparing, there's this rush of adrenaline that just absorbs your whole entire soul, your energy. It's just like your heart is thumping, your mind is racing, and you're whirling, you're dancing, you're in the heat and the fire, and it's sensual and it's exciting, and I imagine it's like any adrenaline junkie job that you can have, and that's what a nightline kitchen is like in a popular restaurant. And so when you walk out of that, you all of a sudden walk into stillness, and that stillness feels disconnected. So you're trying to recreate that intensity, I think, through drugs. And also there's the whole, you're so excited, you just worked, it's 12 o'clock at night. How do you go to sleep and get back the next morning? So you go from the, taking uppers and then taking downers and then taking uppers and then taking downers. And I think a lot of people get, at first it's like, okay, well, this works. I can do this. I can have some alcohol and then crash and then get up the next morning and take a line of Coke and then go back and do it again, or hit a speed and go back and do it again. And you sort of get sucked in slowly as it starts. And then for me, I reached a point where I realized that was defining my whole life and defining my cooking rather than facilitating, if that makes sense. Like, I had used that initially as a way to get to work in the morning and a way to go to sleep at the night, but all of a sudden it was becoming the driving force. And I never wanted to have a driving force other than my passion for food. And I also realized that if I ever wanted to have children or a family, that drugs and kids don't mix. So, that was a sort of basic learning experience that I had when I reached 20, is like, you have a choice. You can either do drugs or you can be a responsible member of society. There's a choice there. So I stopped, but I understand people in the industry, how they don't want to stop and how it's a very, very addictive lifestyle.
So, in contrast, you meet up with a woman after your divorce, and you decide that you're going to become vegan.
Yeah.
Which is in constant contrast to what we've just described before. Just tell me a bit about her and how you decided that you were going to become vegan.
Yeah, so it didn't happen right away. I lived with her for 2 years while I was getting a divorce, and off and on for 2 years. So we just spent a lot of time together, and she was a very peaceful person. She is a very peaceful person. Her name is Lord Charkoudian, and she's now a delegate in Maryland. She has developed a mediation system, which is here in Salisbury University, as well as around Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. Community mediation program, if you're interested in looking it up. And she was probably the kindest, most giving person I'd ever met at that point in my life. She listened. She understood. She tried to understand even when she couldn't understand. She didn't have an ego involved with her own presence. It was really more about understanding what makes other people tick. And that was the first time I understood that being a chef could be about cooking for people in a way that made them happy rather than a way that fueled my own ego or made me look fantastic. It was at that moment, I think, with her that I realized that I could be the most amazing chef in the world, but if somebody couldn't eat my food, then what difference did it make? And that's when food became about taking care of people rather than being awesome. It was all of a sudden that switch that flipped, and it's like, wait, what I do is about nurturing. What I do is about love. And if somebody's vegan and they can't eat what I'm making, then I'm not showing them I love them. I'm showing them that I think I know better. And I decided that I would listen to the people that I was cooking for and find out what made them healthy, happy, and what made them tick. And coincidentally, at that same time, my daughter developed a gluten and dairy allergy. So vegan, gluten, dairy, all of a sudden I had to learn to cook in so many ways that were different from the traditional ways that I had been taught or explored. And so I started to get real creative with making comfort food and loving food in ways that made the people that I loved safe to eat it. I didn't become vegan for another 9-10 years after Lorg, after I lived with Lorg, but that was when the seed was planted of, it is okay not to eat meat and be a chef. Like you can do that. I knew I could at that point.
There's a term, by the way, you use, dirty vegan. What does that mean?
That means that I'm not freakish about it. Like, I don't get upset if there's eggs and things. I don't get upset. Like, when I travel, I eat dairy. It's not a big deal. I'm not going to go to Israel and not eat feta cheese. I'm not going to go to, Sensapulcro and not eat mozzarella. It's just not going to happen. So I'm okay with that. And I know a lot of vegans are not. But for me, that's okay. I'm okay with it. So it's a dirty vegan.
And is there a difference between being a vegetarian and a vegan?
Yeah, so vegetarians eat animal products that don't harm the animal. Okay. So eggs, dairy, honey. Vegans won't eat anything that comes from an animal at all. So anything that is a product of an animal is not consumed. And there are different varying levels of how vegan people are. And that's one of the issues with, when you have somebody come in that is vegan, you have to find out how contamination sensitive they are. Same thing with gluten-free. Like, are they okay with it? Gets really, really defined. There are straight edge vegans that, don't even eat yeast. I mean, there's some really hardcore lines.
And so you talk about what you at least perceive anyway as being the benefits of being a vegan.
Well, I think more than being a vegan, and this is, probably going to be controversial, but I think more than being a vegan, I think the benefits of eating something that is A, grown close to home, so it doesn't travel great distances, B, is seasonal, C, is local, and D, is from whole food made from scratch. So in my own restaurant, what I did was I didn't say, look, I don't eat meat, so nobody can eat meat. That's not what I'm about. What I'm about is everyone making their own choices. If you choose to eat meat, then choose to eat chicken that's grown in a healthy manner without antibiotics and hormones. Choose to eat beef that is grass-fed and free-ranged. And, if you choose to eat pork, then make sure that that's happy pork. And that's going to be something that vegans will be like, no, never. But that's not me. I'm not the person who judges other people's choices. So that's why I'm not labeling this book as a vegan cookbook, because if you'll notice in the recipes, a lot of the recipes are like, if you do a chicken, do it this way. If you do tofu, do it this way. If you want to make it plant-based, use a cauliflower steak. If you want to do it meat-based or salmon-based, use a wild piece of salmon. So I offer other options that may not be my choices, but maybe somebody else's choices. And that's what I did in the restaurant as well. Every dish had a vegan, a vegetarian, and a meat-based or a pescatarian-based alternatives. So you could choose your own protein. I just created the sauces and the preparation technique.
You, by the way, talk about the idea of sort of a meat substitute. That is that's something that, for instance, you might eat a hamburger, but no, it's not made out of meat, it's made out of something else. Mm-hmm. As something that people need, that maybe it's a psychological sense that they've been eating meat all of their life, and then there's something that they just need to see that on the
Sure.
patty on the bun.
Sure. So I call those transition foods because a lot of times people, when they're transitioning from eating meat, eating a lot of meat, and let's face it, Americans eat a lot of meat. When they're transitioning from that, that's what they're comfortable with. And if you say to somebody all of a sudden, hey, you're going to eat chana masala 3 meals a day, and, we might be making some very strange things with red lentils and quinoa loaves and nut this and blah, blah, blah. They're going to be looking at you like you have 3 heads and are you insane? So what we do is we create foods that are familiar in their comfort zones. So a veggie-based burger or a cauliflower steak that's sauced or something that looks like it's a meat-based dish, but it's not. Now, I have friends who have been vegetarian their whole lives, and they don't need that at all because they don't even remember what meat tastes like. They're like, I don't like the taste. I never liked the taste, so just make me whatever you want. It really depends on where you're at in that transition. And one of the things I like to remind people is we live in the United States and everyone could eat less meat here. So even if you don't think you eat a lot of meat, you probably could eat less. So there's always time to switch to that plant-based food, whether it's a meatless Monday or just choosing not to eat meat, during the days. And like they had that plant-based up until 5 diet that came out last year, which, everything that allows people to eat a little less meat and a little bit more healthily, and by healthy I defined as whole foods, not processed, that's a good thing.
Well, that brings me back to the standard American diet. I take you take issue with the standard American diet.
Well, the acronym SAD, I think, describes a lot. We eat processed foods here. We have a very, very high consumption of sugar, and I don't have the exact statistics of how much sugar an average American eats, but it's pretty huge. It's gross. So what I try and do is I try and create foods that replace that sugar that most people are used to in processed foods with caramelized onions and caramelized garlic and other ways of sweetening dishes that people can get that comfort from, because your palate has 4 flavor centers. It's salty, sweet, spicy, and sour. And if you don't have those flavor centers register, you're not satisfied. And comfort food is usually salty or sweet. So what I try and do is replace that sweet in the comfort food with some other sugar substitute that isn't necessarily sugar, which, agave is sugar, honey is sugar, all those things are sugar. So you have to caramelize vegetables, caramelize fruits, really bring natural foods down into their most base elements to make that sort of sugar feeling in your mouth that substitutes then the comfort foods.
And of course, we here on the shore, up and down the peninsula, we have farmers markets. I mean, they're everywhere. Tell me a little bit about the significance of those markets. But what is it like to be part of one of those markets, to shop there? What are the people like? What was that experience like?
Shopping and participating in the market are 2 entirely different things. I love shopping in the farmers market. Participating in a farmers market and being a vendor is really, really hard, which is one of the reasons why I'm so adamant about supporting them, because these farmers work so hard. They get up at, unbelievable hours, way before dawn. They pack their trucks, they've picked their produce, or they've milked their cows. They get to the farmer's market, they have like 3 or 4 hours to sell all their goods. And if they don't sell them, then they go home and they've lost money. So I really believe that supporting farmers markets are one of the most important things we can do to support our community. Personally, for me, being at the farmer's market was absolutely exhausting. And I think part of it was the time of my life, because I was working 6 days a week and the farmer's market was on my day off. And that was just one more thing that I had to do. And it was too much. But that being said, it certainly helped with my restaurant, getting people through the door of the restaurant, and it created community with the farmers that I bought from for the restaurant. So I could go to the farmer's market, pick up my produce, take it back to the restaurant, meet people, send them to the restaurant if they were vegan, gluten-free, or they needed special dietary choices.
So if I go to a farmer's market, obviously it depends on who I am and what my tastes are. What should I be looking for?
Well, you should be talking to the farmer and asking them how they raise their produce, how they raise their chickens, how they raise their cows, what they do. What you'll find with farmers markets is, first of all, antibiotics, pesticides, and insecticides are very expensive. And most farmers are pretty careful and judicious about how they spray and how they treat their animals, because they don't want to create that extra expense, and they don't want to, tear up their ground or mistreat their farm soil or mistreat their animals. I mean, most farmers are really conscious. But ask questions, talk to them. When I was buying for the restaurant, I would go and visit the farms that I was buying from so that I could see for myself, how they farmed, what they did. And I will tell you, working for Edible Delmarva, writing articles for them, I've also been visiting a lot of farms over this past year. And it's really fun. I mean, going to a farm is like being a kid all over again. When I tell my daughter that we're going to a farm, she gets all excited. She's like, oh, what is it this time? Is it cows? Is it pigs? Is it chickens? Is it, where are we going? And she loves it because it is such a fun place to be a child.
So some other places, Mexico, you talk about also going to Israel. Mm-hmm. What is it like tasting and exploring foods that are overseas, as opposed to, say, exploring those same foods here.
Yeah, it is different because I find that a lot of restaurants that are ethnic have Americanized their palates. I mean, certainly that's true about Chinese restaurants more than almost any other thing. But it is very different to try the foods that are indigenous to a culture in the space of that culture. And that's one of the things I love to do is actually go into the markets wherever I go, the open air markets, and watch people in the open air markets do their cooking because that's where you really learn the techniques. It's almost like watching the Food Channel. You can sit there and watch people make tortillas, and then you really know how to make tortillas if you're watching somebody do it for an hour. You're like, okay, I know how to make a tortilla. I'm going to go do that. And you can ask questions, and you can really get in there and see what's going on. There's this wonderful market I love in Tepoztlan that's in the just nestled right in the center of Zocalo. And you can literally walk from one booth to another booth to another booth, and they're making the ancient Mayan foods that were indigenous to that region. And they're so different than what we have learned in this country as Mexican cuisine, because it's not Mexican, it's Indian. And it's just phenomenal. It's so out there. And you know, like you can't get that here when you go to I can't think of a Mexican chain right now, but you can't get that here when you go to one of those Mexican chains. You're not going to get something with chaya. You're not going to get something with quinoa. You're not going to get you're not going to get huitlacoche. Do you know how hard it is to find huitlacoche in this country? I can't get it to save my life. And I know a ton of corn farmers. They're like, yeah, no, we spray for that stuff. I don't want that stuff on my corn. And it's the greatest delicacy you've ever had is huitlacoche.
So, in fact, you call Mexico your home.
Yeah.
Why do you say that? And I think you talk a lot about the women that you see there, that they
Sure.
compassionate, but also they could be stern.
It's my spiritual home, I think. You know, when I'm there, I am so happy. You know, there's nothing that makes me sad in Mexico. I always feel incredibly safe. I always feel loved. I always feel comforted. And whenever I need to deal with something that's sort of thorny, whenever I want to write, I go there for weeks at a time and just, you know, stay in a little tiny place and hole up and, you know, walk the streets and visit the markets. And it is the women. I speak fluent Spanish, so that makes me very, very happy when I'm home. And it doesn't matter where in Mexico I am, I feel home. It's a happy place. It's my happy place.
So you, as a chef, I'll sort of briefly quote something that you said, because it comes back to something that I said in the introduction. You said, I never planned to be a chef, never fantasized about it as a dream job, never considered it as a fallback. Restaurant work was blue collar and low class, so my career is a result of waiting to be something else.
Yeah. Wow. Can't believe I wrote that. Sometimes I forget the things I write. That's what it was to be a chef at the time that I grew up. And remember, this was before the Food Channel. This was before the Food Network. This was before the glamour of Emeril Lagasse and Paul Prudhomme. And it was, you know, basically you're talking Julia Child and Pierre Franey. And those were the, you know, the sort of food icons that we had. And they were not glamour queens, let's face it. My family, and who knows if it's just or unjust, but they treated the food industry as very blue collar. And in order to have an acceptable job, you needed to do something that required an advanced degree. You needed to marry well. You needed to live in a big house. It was very materialistic, to use a nice word. And the food industry does not give you that kind of security for the most part. Now, you can be successful in the food industry, certainly, but there's so many other jobs you can do and be a lot more successful. And success in my family was just defined as money. So, you know, being a chef was not something you did for glamour. If you wanted glamour, go be an actress in Hollywood. You know, being a chef is not glamorous. Plus, it's a really dirty job. I mean, I don't know if people actually understand that 99% of what you do is dealing with fire, knives, and lifting stuff. You know, I mean, you're flipping pans. When I stopped cooking full time, I had to go actually start lifting weights to keep up keep up my arm strength, because I lifted so much on a daily basis. I literally did not have to lift, and now I have to lift every day in order to keep up my back strength and arm strength.
Now, you had a restaurant, Hobos, and you recently you decided that you were going to get out of it. So what has life been like outside of that? certainly crazy quality to the food industry. Certainly running a restaurant has got to be similar to maybe something as long ago as the 80s. What's your life been like now? What is it pursued? And how does that contrast with maybe running the restaurant?
Well, I decided to close the restaurant because I realized that it had consumed me. And my children were still young. My eldest daughter was 2 years away from college, and the other one was just entering middle school. And I realized that I really had not been present for most of their childhood, other than 1 day a week, 2 days a week. And I get that that's fairly typical for a family. You're home on the weekends. But I wasn't even home at nights because I would not finish cooking till 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And it's hard to be a parent. And that was one of the big reasons that I decided to close. The other big reason was I realized that I was beginning to resent it. I was beginning to resent the demands of my time and feel that the restaurant was consuming everything that I was. I couldn't finish my book. I couldn't write. I couldn't travel. I couldn't do all the things that really feed my soul and make me who I am. So since closing, I have, for the first couple months, I spent very, very quiet, and I just tried to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And if that wasn't a chef, what was that going to be? Because I'd been a chef for so long. And I decided I wanted to write about food and to write. And so basically, over the last 2 years, I've learned how to write. Like, I feel when I first started, I was not a very good writer, but in the process of doing my blog every week and really writing for magazines, and I've written for several magazines, and really working on my craft, I feel that I've become much better, and I feel that I can give a lot in the way of perspective about food at this age, and even more than I can give perspective on being in the restaurant industry, because there's so many restaurants. What's one more? But how many people are actually talking about our relationship with food? That's not a common conversation. And most of the conversations that are had about our relationship with food are not from the perspective that food is love and food is comfort and food is nurturing. They're really more about you should be and do this and do that and diet and lose weight. And they're not embracing. They're really pretty narrowly defining, if that makes sense.
We're speaking with Gretchen Hansen. She has a new book out, When It's Done, The Making of a Chef. Might also tell people that there are a bunch of recipes in there, which we didn't talk about.
There are hundreds of recipes.
But you can check those out as well, and we appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us this morning.
Thank you so much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.